July 16, 1945, New Mexico desert. 5:19 in the morning. A man stands alone in a concrete bunker, 6 miles from a steel tower. He has not slept in 2 days. On top of that tower sits a device his own mind designed. He knows exactly what it will do. He has run the numbers himself. He wrote the equations. He explained them to generals who didn't understand them. He signed his name to the authorization, and now he stands here, in the dark, waiting for the thing he built to prove him right. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the desert turns into a second sun. The man watching doesn't cheer. He doesn't move. He stands very still while the shockwave reaches him, and later, when asked what he felt in that exact moment, he recalled a line from an ancient Hindu scripture, a line about a god revealing his true, terrible form to a man who had asked to see it. "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he was not a monster. That is the part that should keep you awake. He was not a monster. He was one of the most brilliant, most humane, most morally serious men of the 20th century. He read Sanskrit for pleasure. He wrote poetry. He wept at concerts. He was the kind of person who made everyone around him feel more alive, more intelligent, more significant just by being in the same room. And he built the weapon anyway, knowing what it was, knowing what it would do, knowing somewhere beneath all the justifications and the momentum and the fear that it was wrong. This video is not about a bomb. It is about the machinery inside the human mind that allows a good person to do the thing they already know is wrong. And the reason you need to understand that machinery is simple. It is not Oppenheimer's machinery. It is yours. It has always been yours. The scale is different. The mechanism is identical. The relationship you haven't left. The job that is quietly taking years off your life. The thing you do at midnight that you already know you'll regret at 7 the next morning. The conversation you keep not having. The decision you keep not making. You already know. You have known for a while. The question this video is going to answer is not why you don't know. It is why knowing has never been enough to stop you, and the answer will change how you see every decision you make from here. The Greeks had a word for this, akrasia. It means, roughly, acting against your own better judgment, doing the thing you know you shouldn't do, choosing what you know is wrong. Aristotle spent an entire section of his ethics trying to explain how akrasia was even possible, because logically it shouldn't be. If you know something is wrong, the knowledge itself should be enough to stop you. That's the whole idea of knowing something, and yet every human being who has ever lived has experienced this. Usually before breakfast, Aristotle never fully resolved it. Neither did the philosophers who came after him for 2,000 years. It took laboratory experiments and brain scans and decades of psychology research to finally explain what was actually happening. What they found was not what anyone expected. The problem was never knowledge. The problem was the story. In 1939, a physicist named Leo Szilard understood something that terrified him. Nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom, could theoretically be used to build a weapon of almost unimaginable destructive power. And Germany had some of the best nuclear physicists in the world. Germany had discovered fission first, in a laboratory in Berlin. Szilard went to Einstein. Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt. And the race that would define the 20th century quietly began when Oppenheimer was appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project in 1942. He understood exactly what he was being asked to do. There was no ambiguity, no comfortable abstraction. He was being asked to build a device that, if it worked, would erase a city in a single moment. He said yes, and his reason at that moment was real. It was genuine. It was even, by a certain cold logic, defensible if Germany built this weapon first. The world that followed was unthinkable. The most reasonable thing a morally serious person could do in the world as it existed in 1942 was ensure that the weapon existed first, in hands less willing to use it for pure domination. This is the first move the mind makes, and it is worth naming precisely, because you have made it yourself. More times than you would be comfortable counting, the question stops being, "Is this right?" and quietly becomes, "Am I the least bad option available?" Once that shift happens, the mind is no longer evaluating the action. It is building the case for it. You have done this, not with weapons, with the things that felt enormous to you at the time. The information you passed along because someone else was going to share it anyway. The shortcut you took because everyone on the team was taking it. The line you crossed because if you didn't, someone less careful would. It feels like moral reasoning from the inside. It sounds like moral reasoning. It arrives in the voice of moral reasoning. It is the mind's most refined method for escaping moral reasoning entirely. Dressed in its clothes, speaking in its register, arriving every single time at exactly the conclusion that was already decided before the thinking began. By 1945, Oppenheimer had been at Los Alamos for 3 years of his life. His identity, his name attached to every significant decision made inside that secret city in the New Mexico desert. In the spring of that year, Germany surrendered. The original reason for racing to build the bomb quietly ceased to exist. A group of scientists led by Szilard drafted a petition. Germany was gone. The weapon should not be used against Japanese cities without warning, without first demonstrating its power somewhere unpopulated, without giving civilization a chance to understand what had been created before it was used. The petition reached Oppenheimer's desk. He did not sign it. By some accounts, he discouraged others from signing it. And here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because this was not the decision of a man who had stopped caring. It was the decision of a man who had built 3 years of himself into something and could no longer see it from the outside. Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to keep going with something not because it is still the right choice, but because you have already invested too much of yourself to stop now. It doesn't feel like weakness from the inside. That is the thing about it. It never does. From the inside, it feels like loyalty, like integrity, like being someone who sees things through when it matters. The mind is extraordinarily practiced at renaming its own unwillingness to stop as virtue. Here is a question worth sitting with, not about Oppenheimer, about yourself, knowing everything you know right now. If you were starting from zero today, would you choose this? Not how much have you already put in. Not what would it mean about those years if you stopped. Not what would people think. Just this, would you choose it today? From nothing, if the only thing on the table was the actual choice itself. Most people, when they answer that question honestly, know the answer immediately. They have known for a long time. What they didn't have was permission to take the answer seriously. Because taking it seriously means everything that came before it cost more than they're ready to admit. There is a concept in psychology that explains almost everything that happened inside Oppenheimer's mind between 1942 and 1945, and it explains almost everything that happens inside your mind on an ordinary Tuesday. The psychologist Leon Festinger called it cognitive dissonance. It describes what happens when a person holds two beliefs that cannot both be true at the same time, I am a good person. I'm doing something I know is wrong. The mind cannot hold these two things together without significant distress. Not metaphorical distress, measurable, physiological, real distress. And it will do almost anything to relieve it. There are only two honest ways. Change what you believe about yourself, or change what you are doing. But there is a third way, and the mind reaches for it almost every time, because it is the only option that requires nothing to actually change. Change the story. Not, I am doing something I know is wrong, but I am doing the necessary thing that someone in my position has to do. Not, I am staying somewhere that is slowly diminishing me, but I am honoring something. I'm being loyal. I'm someone who doesn't abandon what they committed to. Not, I'm building something that will kill people. But I'm ending this faster, saving more than I cost. Doing what history requires of this specific terrible moment. This is not lying in the way we normally think about lying. It is something more unsettling than that. The story is not fabricated out of nothing. It is built from real materials, real truths, real parts of a situation that genuinely exist, and then assembled in exactly the configuration that allows the behavior to continue. The most dangerous stories are the ones that are 60% true. A complete lie is relatively easy to catch. A story that is mostly true, mostly fair, mostly accurate, but arranged in precisely the way that leads you to the conclusion you needed. That is nearly impossible to see from the inside, because it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like the truth, which is exactly what it was designed to feel like. Think about the last time you stayed in something long after you already knew, not suspected, not wondered, knew. What was the story? That for most people, it falls into one of a few recognizable shapes. The obligation story. I can't leave now. People are depending on me. If I go, everything falls apart. The investment story. I've put too much into this to walk away. All of that would have been for nothing. The comparison story. It's not that bad. Other people have it much worse. I don't have the right to complain about this. The timing story. Just not right now, soon. When things settle down. When the moment is better. The identity story. This is just who I am. This is how I'm built. People like me don't get to want something different. Every single one of these stories has something true in it. That's the point. That's the job. Borrow enough truth to be believable. Use it to make the knowing feel manageable. Keep everything in place until the cost of staying finally outweighs the cost of the story collapsing. Oppenheimer's story held for 3 years. Some people's stories hold for decades. Some people take them to the grave intact, never having looked at them directly. The question is not whether you have a story. You do, everyone does. The question is whether you are willing to look at what it is protecting you from having to decide. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment that would disturb the psychological community for the next 50 years. Ordinary volunteers were brought into a laboratory, one at a time. They were told they were participating in a study about memory and learning. They were seated in front of a panel of switches, labeled from mild to severe 2, at the very end, a level marked simply, danger. They were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another participant in the next room every time that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks would increase with each wrong answer. The other participant was an actor. No shocks were ever real. But the volunteer had no way of knowing this. As the voltage climbed, the actor could be heard through the wall. First complaining, then protesting, then pleading. Then at the highest levels, going silent in a way that suggested something had gone very wrong. All the volunteer had to do to stop was say no. Before running the study, Milgram asked a group of psychiatrists to predict how many people would go all the way to the final, most dangerous level. The estimate was roughly 1 in 1,000. Only a deeply disturbed individual, they said, would continue past the point of obvious distress. The actual number was 2 in 3. 2 out of every 3 ordinary. People, teachers, engineers, accountants, people with families and values and no history of cruelty. 2 out of 3 of them continued all the way to the end. Because a calm voice beside them said the experiment required it. No threats, no force, no punishment for stopping, just a calm voice and the fact that they had already come this far. What Milgram captured was not a collection of hidden sadists. He captured the staircase. The experiment was never one enormous moral decision. It was 30 small ones, each slightly more than the one before, each defensible barely in the context of what had already happened. At no single point did any volunteer face a moment that felt, in isolation, like a dramatic leap into wrongdoing. It just kept moving, one reasonable step at a time, until they were somewhere they never would have agreed to go if they had been shown the destination at the beginning. And this is the architecture of almost everything we are discussing in this video. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to stay in something that is slowly ending them. They just keep not leaving. One more week, one more reason, one more story about why now is not the time. Nobody decides to become the person they once promised they would never be. They just keep taking the next reasonable step, and somewhere in the middle of all those reasonable steps, they cross a line they didn't notice crossing, because it was never marked. Because lines rarely are, the staircase does not announce itself. It just keeps going. And if you never look down, you never see how far you've come from where you started. Hiroshima. August 6th, 1945. Nagasaki. 3 days later, the reports reached Los Alamos within hours. Numbers first, then photographs, then accounts that could no longer be managed through the language of strategy and necessity. Not structures, people, families at breakfast, children walking to school. Oppenheimer addressed the assembled scientists. By the accounts of people who were present, he was initially triumphant. He raised his fists, but something began to change almost immediately. The story that had carried him for 3 years began to encounter something it couldn't contain. Detail, real, specific, irreducible human detail. In October of 1945, he sat across from President Truman in the Oval Office. He said in some form that he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman's response was contempt. He reportedly told an aide afterward that he never wanted to see that man again, that the guilt was weakness, self-indulgence, a philosopher's vanity dressed up as conscience. 2 men, 1 decision, 2 entirely different relationships with the same truth. 1 man whose story had finally broken open. 1 man whose story was still holding, would always hold, had to hold, because without it the thing he had ordered became unbearable. Neither of them was wrong about what they felt. What separated them was not intelligence or character. It was simply which story had, by October of 1945, stopped being able to do its job. Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life trying to give something back to the world he had changed. He became the most prominent voice for restraint in the nuclear age. He argued for international oversight of atomic weapons. He wrote and spoke publicly about what had been created and what its existence meant for the future. The government that had needed his genius rewarded him by stripping his security clearance in a public humiliation in 1954. His old left-wing associations, the causes he had supported before the war, were used against him. His newfound conscience was presented as evidence of disloyalty. He spent his final years outside the corridors of power he had once walked freely. When he died in 1967, the obituaries remembered a brilliant man. Almost all of them also remembered a haunted one, not because the guilt destroyed him, but because the knowing never left. It had never left. Not even in 1942 when he said yes. Not in 1945 when he didn't sign the petition. Not in the bunker when the desert lit up. The knowing was always there. Beneath the story, waiting, he built it anyway. And what he lived with afterward was not punishment from the outside. It was the experience of living in a version of your own life that the story can no longer make comfortable. That is the real cost. Not the external consequences, the internal ones, the ones that arrive in quiet moments, that cannot be reasoned with or managed, that simply sit there steady and clear, because the story finally has nothing left to say. This is where the video turns the lens completely, because none of what we have discussed, the sunk cost, the cognitive dissonance, the story, the staircase, none of it is actually about a man who built a bomb in 1945. It is about the thing you are currently not looking at directly. You know what it is. I don't need to name it. You named it yourself somewhere in the last few minutes. The question is not whether you know. You do. The question is what your current story is costing you to maintain, and whether that cost is something you can absorb for another year, another 5 years, another version of your life. There are 4 things worth understanding about the story, not to condemn yourself for having it, but to finally see it clearly enough to make a real choice. The first, the story will always cast you as the reluctant hero, not as someone doing something wrong, as someone doing the necessary, difficult thing that falls to people like you, the person holding everything together, the person with no real alternative. The moment you notice yourself as the reluctant hero of your own justification, slow down. Ask what it looks like from outside the version you are telling. Ask who else's story it is, and what they would say the reluctance is actually protecting. The second, psychologists call it moral licensing, the use of past good behavior as quiet permission for present behavior. I have been so patient. I have given so much. I have earned this. None of those things may be false, but they are doing a specific job. They are building a credit account that the next decision is going to spend. Your history of goodness is real. It is also, when the mind needs it to be, the exact thing that stops you from looking too closely at what you are doing right now. The third, watch for the moment your internal language stops asking and starts explaining. Is this right? Leaves room for the answer to be no. Everyone would understand why I did this is already a closing argument, built in advance, for a jury not yet assembled. The asking is where the conscience is still awake. The explaining is where it has been replaced by something very fluent and very convinced of itself. When you catch yourself reaching for the phrases that feel like honesty, but arrive before conclusions that benefit you. Slow down before the sentence finishes. Ask what questions stopped being asked right before those words appeared. The fourth, stop waiting for clarity. Clarity is not the missing ingredient. It has never been the missing ingredient. Oppenheimer had more clarity about the cost of what he was building than almost anyone in history, and it did not stop him. If you are waiting to finally see clearly before you change something, you may be waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive. Because you already see clearly enough. You have for a while. The clarity is not the problem. The story is the problem. And the story will not leave on its own. It will keep arriving on schedule, in the same clothes with the same arguments, for as long as you need it to, until the day it can no longer hold against the weight of what it has been covering, by which point the decision you kept not making will have made itself. There is one more thing worth understanding about Oppenheimer, and it is the part of his story that almost no one talks about. In the years after 1945, after the security hearings, after the stripped clearance, after the public humiliation designed to make an example of him, people expected him to disappear. He didn't. He kept writing. He kept lecturing. He kept thinking in public, which had always been his most natural mode of existence, but something in him had changed. Not broken, changed. The man who had once been able to speak with absolute certainty about the necessity of difficult choices now spoke differently, more slowly, with longer pauses before conclusions, as if he had learned to distrust the speed of his own conviction. In an interview near the end of his life, he was asked whether he regretted what he had built. He paused for a long time. Then he said something that was not quite yes and not quite no. He said that the question assumed he had been free at any given point to make a different choice, and that this was the assumption he was no longer sure about. Not because he was denying responsibility, but because he had spent 20 years watching how the choices had accumulated, how each reasonable step had made the next one easier, how by the time the truly large decision arrived, the small decisions had already built the road to it. He was not excusing himself. He was describing something, the way the staircase works, the way it always works, for everyone, and what he seemed to be arriving at slowly in the years that were left to him was not forgiveness of himself, but something stranger and more useful, a clarity about the mechanism, about how a person of genuine conscience ends up somewhere their conscience never agreed to go, not through weakness, not through selfishness, but through the accumulation of moments that were each individually too small to name. That clarity cost him almost everything, and it was the most valuable thing he had to offer anyone who came after, because the alternative to understanding how the staircase works is simply climbing it, convincing yourself at each step that you are one of the people who will notice before it goes too far. Most people who end up somewhere they never intended also believe that the staircase does not select for the foolish. It selects for people who are convinced they are not the kind of person it happens to, which is almost everyone. At almost every step, right up until the moment they look down, there is a version of every life where the story gets interrupted earlier. Not a perfect version, not a clean one. Real change is almost never clean, but a version where the moment you catch yourself reframing the question, you notice where the sunk cost stops feeling like commitment and starts being named for what it is, where you ask yourself, seriously, whether the you of a few years ago would recognize the choices the current version is making, and whether you are all right with the distance between those two people. That version of your life is not somewhere in the future. It is available in the next decision you make. The next moment the story arrives on schedule, dressed in its familiar clothes. You can look at it differently, not with judgment, not with the intention of dismantling yourself, but with the kind of slow, honest attention that Oppenheimer spent his last years practicing, and his earlier years avoiding. The people who navigate this best are not the ones with the strongest willpower. They are the ones who have learned to be curious about their own stories, who treat the story not as the truth, but as data, as something to examine, to hold up to the light, to ask quietly what it is trying to protect, and then to decide from that slightly larger vantage point whether the protection is still worth the cost. Most of the time, when you finally see the story clearly, the choice becomes obvious. Not easy, not without grief, but obvious. The clarity was always there, underneath, patient, waiting for the story to step aside long enough to let it through. The question this video leaves you with is not about Oppenheimer. It is about the staircase you are standing on right now. How many steps you have already taken, whether you have looked down recently, and whether the story you are telling yourself about why you are still climbing is the kind that holds for another 20 years, or the kind that breaks, and whether, if it breaks on its own terms and in its own time, you will still be able to recognize the life that's left, or whether you will be standing somewhere you never meant to be, looking at a distance you cannot close. Finally awake, the difference between those two endings is not intelligence. It is not willpower. It is not character. It is simply whether you are willing to ask one honest question before the answer becomes something you have to live inside. VeilMind. Decode the hidden rules of the mind. They never taught you this in school.